This presentation is about the main features of Mali political practice and ceremony based on the evidence found in an excerpt of Ibn Battuta. This presentation was created by Sarah Johnson, Jamila Anderson, Lexi Everett, and Justin Bottrager. Ibn Battuta was a 14th century Muslim legal scholar. He set out on his own to complete his Hajj, which is a Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. Within his 30 years, he had visited most of the Islamic nations, as well as various non-Muslim nations that spanned from North Africa, the Horn of Africa, West Africa, and Eastern Europe in the West, into the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even China. Many years later, after the end of his various expeditions, Ibn Battuta retold the story of his travels so that they may be dictated into writing at the request of the Sultan of Morocco. Ibn Battuta's description and story of Mali and other Islamic nations was one of the earliest historical sources during the 14th century that shed light on the cultures and customs of other lands. This map here provides more context into Ibn Battuta's travels. As demonstrated by the key, he first traveled around the northern Arabian Peninsula and onto the North African coast. Following that, he spent his travels around the southern half of the Arabian Peninsula and the East African coast. Next, he traveled far, spanning between Eastern Europe, Iran, India, and parts of Asia for the longest part of his journey, which lasted roughly 15 years. And lastly, he spent his older years traveling around Western Africa, specifically Mali, which is where our focus begins. When Ibn Battuta first visited Cairo in 1326, he undoubtedly heard about the visit of Mansa Musa, who was the king of Mali from 1307 to 1332. Mansa Musa had passed through the city 2 years earlier, making his pilgrimage to Mecca, with thousands of slaves and soldiers, wives, and officials. 100 camels each carried 100 pounds of gold. Mansa Musa performed many acts of charity and flooded Cairo with his kindness. So much gold spent in the markets of Cairo actually upset the gold market well into the next century. Mali's gold was important all over the world. In the later medieval period, West Africa may have been producing almost 2/3 of the world's supply of gold. Mali also supplied other trade items such as ivory, ostrich feathers, kola nuts, hides, and slaves. No wonder there was talk about the kingdom of Mali and its riches. And no wonder Ibn Battuta, still restless after his trip to Al-Andalus, set his mind on visiting the sub-Saharan kingdom. And this really sparked his curiosity of an Islamic nation that displayed such opulence in contradiction to the Islamic faith. This was a driving force between Ibn's desire to travel through Mali and also now in turn the driving force of our presentation. A trip to Mali, like all others, would be made easier because of already established trade routes controlled by the Muslims. The rulers and many businessmen of Mali had converted to Islam a generation before, and Muslim traders had come to live in Mali's business centers. Ibn Battuta could not resist another trip before he settled down. Or perhaps he thought about settling in Mali, where the converts and Muslim settlers, and even the king, which they called the Sultan, were hungry for Islamic education and law. Our presentation compares some of the differences in ancient Mali from before it became an Islamic nation to after and its characteristics. So some features of Mali politics that are necessary to understand the differences here is that the kingdom was ruled by a sultan whose reign was empowered through Islam. So it was a interesting relationship between the leaders of both religion and politics. But the governance was under a blend of Islamic religion and African tradition. So that resulted in some ideological contradictions between the people and philosophers of this time, including Ibn Battuta. And the difference of piety between Islamic men and women in the Mali kingdom is a driving force between the contradictions and religious point of views at this time. So the praising of the king was a large part of ancient Mali culture. The king of Mali was known as the Sultan of Mali is Mansa Suleiman, Mansa meaning sultan in Mandingo. So the sultan was of Islamic faith, which was also the faith of the Mali kingdom at that time, and it intermixed their Islamic faith into the sultan's rule as their authoritarian. This conclusion of a ceremony led with not only the reading of the Quran, followed by a prayer for the sultan. Ibn Battuta said reading desks were brought in, and the Quran was read through. Then they prayed for our master, Abul Hazan, and also for Mansa Suleiman. The balance between the praising of the king and the praising of the Quran came into play a lot through the spread of Islam and through conversion of the nation. So Islam and Mali tradition regarding women was big in the politics. So Ibn Battuta was taken back here by the local customs in Mali regarding the sexes because he said in his mind man and women should be separate in an Islamic society, and here the sexes were friends. They spent time with one another and they were agreeable. So women were often nude in Mali in public, which was very conflicting since Islam frowned upon a lack of sanctity with attire. All Mali women were and girls were nude in public, which was conflicting since Islam frowned upon this. Also, the experiences of Muslim women vary widely between and within different societies, and at the same time, their adherence to Islam is a shared factor that affects their lives to a varying degree and gives them a common identity that may serve to bridge the wide cultural, social, and economic differences between them. Modesty is a religious prescription in Islam, and the Quran commands both men and women to dress modestly and not to display their bodies. And Muhammad asserted that modesty is a central character trait in Islam. The typical practice of Islam directly conflicted practices Ibn Battuta witnessed here with the women in ancient Mali. And many times the women in ancient Mali bared their breasts, and some believe that this type of behavior is commonly seen by Islamic scholars and the broader Muslim public alike as emblematic of a state of spiritual ignorance. So these points highly stress the contradictions between the African kingdom and the Islamic faith. Um, One being wealth, the opulence of their ceremonies and display of wealth. Ibn regarded the piety of the Mali men with much respect and admiration for the devotion to the Islamic faith. And I quote, another of their good qualities is their habit of wearing clean white garments on Friday. Even if a man has nothing but an old worn shirt, he washes it and cleans it and wears it to the Friday service. Clothing was very important at this time in ancient Mali. Another thing that is a high contradiction is the nakedness of women, as mentioned before. The men of Mali placed much regard and sanctity into their garb, which was a stark difference to the normalcy of nakedness from the Mali women. And lastly, the Sultan using the humility of Islam to his advantage was of high contradiction, where we said the men took much pride in the importance of their prayer and would send their sons to reserve their place in the mosque. It is a custom of theirs to send each man his boy to the mosque with his prayer mat. The boy spreads it out for his master in a place befitting him and remains on it until he comes to the mosque. To talk more about Mali's ceremonial practices, Mali was classified by its abundance of gold both before and after Islamic times. Mali's traditional ceremonies were classified by their elaborately decorated instruments that were played, as mentioned here by Ibn Battuta, when he said the Sultan is preceded by his musicians who carry gold and silver gumbri, which were two-string guitars. And then after Mali became an Islamic state, their abundance of gold and wealth was shown more through their garments, or for women servants, their lack thereof. As mentioned earlier, this could have been due to a state of spiritual ignorance, or could have simply been to demonstrate their lack of wealth and belongings. Both time periods in ancient Mali demonstrated their abundance of gold and how they used that in their ceremonies and rituals. So, in conclusion, this project taught us all about the importance of different things in ancient Malian society and traditions. It showed us the value they put on extravagant decorations and accessories, and how these decorations and accessories played a role in ancient Malian ceremonies and political practices. It also gave us insight into the trade done by and from Mali, the treatment of people, and their activities both religiously and politically. And lastly, for our works cited, we used the medieval sourcebook found on the Fordham University website to get an excerpt by Ibn Battuta on Mali. We also used Wikipedia's information, the culture of Mali, and on Ibn Battuta, as well as these sites for images.